I'm sure that like almost everyone in the room knows Dr. Lisa Anderson. I don't need to introduce her. Yet let me say that Dr. Anderson is Dean Emerita, School of International and Public Affairs, Columbia University. She was appointed as president of AUC, American University in Cairo, in January 2011. And I think the School of Global Affairs and Public Policy was like initially established with all her efforts and ideas. So Dr. Lisa, would you please join us? Thank you.
Thank you very much. It is a delight to be back on campus and to see so many friends and colleagues. I particularly want to thank the Dean for this invitation, both to participate at the advisory board meeting, which we did this morning, and to offer a few remarks. As most of you know, I am a political scientist and I study this region. So I'm a little bit out of my depth in talking about the United States, but that was my assignment. And I take solace in the fact that everyone is out of their depth in talking about the United States right now. The one thing I can assure you is that having lived in Egypt for nearly 8 years has prepared me well for the current political scene in the United States, because I've never seen as much political humor in the United States as I've seen for the last 18 months. But otherwise, it's hard to find clear indications of the directions of politics in the United States. So yes, humor has picked up, but other than that, it's a little difficult for any of us to tell exactly where the United States is going. So what I thought I would do is frame my brief remarks around a sort of set of questions about policy at the national, federal level in the United States, and then about politics and administration, since that seems to be consistent with the purposes of the school, if nothing else. So, as you all know, a little less than a year and a half ago, Donald Trump was elected president of the United States. That was a surprise to everyone, including him. And it's clear that people have spent a lot of time around the election and since trying to figure out what his policy inclinations, his strategic view of the world, and of his purposes as president are. And I think it's fair to say that within the first 6 months or so of his administration, some things began to become pretty clear and continue to be relatively consistent in terms of his view of the world. And the first thing that people who followed American foreign policy noted was that he was, and in fact he was for decades before running for president, quite hostile to what is known as the liberal international order of the last 75 years. This is interesting for an American president to be, since the major beneficiary, major designer and beneficiary of that liberal international order was, in fact, the United States. But it's nonetheless the case that if you look at what Donald Trump said before his campaign, during his campaign, and since he was elected, he has very little regard for the institutions of the liberal international order, including the Bretton Woods institutions, the United Nations, and so forth. This is why the Republican foreign policy establishment split quite dramatically around his campaign, because there are many Republicans who are big enthusiasts of that international order, and who felt that Trump constituted a betrayal of their commitment. So you see a group of people who actually did support Trump and did go into the administration, but I would think it's fair to say that much of the foreign policy establishment did not, and some of them became what are known as never Trump Republicans. In general, this hostility or skepticism about the international order is consistent with a view that Donald Trump has reflected both in foreign policy and international affairs and domestically, that is pretty hostile to law and regulation of any kind, seeing, in a sense, these institutions as constraining him rather than providing order. So you see that in many of the kinds of things that he's done domestically. He simply wants to do things. He doesn't necessarily have much regard for process. And in a way, in general, he sees both the world around him and the world as we understand it when we think of global affairs as in an anarchic state of nature in which all is fair and might makes right. So this is a very, very different, whatever you might think of the difference between, for example, George W. Bush and Barack Obama, this is yet a very different view of the world. And in that sense, Bush and Obama shared a general sense of having to work through systems, and the systems were ultimately to the benefit of the United States and the international system and to the benefit of the elites that they represented domestically, but they were prepared to work through those systems. Trump, by contrast, is anti-establishment, admires what he thinks of as strong leaders, often known as authoritarians by the American foreign policy establishment. He's not consistently pro-business or consistently populist. He basically embraces strength and power where he sees it. So he can be protectionist on trade, which is a pro-labor position, and he can cut taxes domestically, which is essentially a pro-business position. So he doesn't really have a ideological position. He simply wants to enhance what he views as the strength and power of the United States and of the executive in the United States. But as I suggest, he is pretty consistently hostile to rules. That's true in his own life. It's true in his approach to his relations with other branches of the American government, and it is consistent with his relationship as president to the rest of the world. As I say, law and order, international treaties, international organizations are all things that are tying his hands, in his view, unnecessarily. There was recently an article about Trump's view of law and order, and this was really about the United States, but I think it's also an expression of his foreign policy view. Crime is not defined by a specific offense. Crime is defined by who does it. And insofar as that's true, then I think that does give you a sense of how he's approaching a lot of the political issues across his desk. The American emphasis on the rule of law and on international order, which, as I suggested, is at least 75 years old, in some ways much older than that, has been turned on its head, and exceptions become the norm. So Trump really wants to operate as if he were in a state of exception all the time. How has this worked in specific policies and so forth? Well, I'm not going to reiterate everything that the Trump administration has been characterized by, but the embrace of or admiration of unapologetically authoritarian regimes and leaders, including Vladimir Putin and President Xi of China, but also Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates, is an indication of his enthusiasm for unconstrained power, and the less constraint, the better. So I think there's a view in the United States, at least, that one of the reasons why Trump has always been as indulgent, if you will, of Vladimir Putin and Russia is because the Russians have something on him, as it were. That may be true, but I actually think it's also a genuine admiration for an individual who has been able to unconstrain himself and simply rule on the basis of whatever he, that is to say Putin, wants to do. There's also clearly a preference for sort of informal as opposed to formal criteria for appointments within the United States or for groups and decisions about who the country should be friendly with or unfriendly with. Preference for family, ethnic, racial and gender criteria for making decisions as opposed to what we would call technical qualifications or rule-bound. You see that both in terms of the composition of the cabinet and the staff in the White House, which is remarkably gender unbalanced and remarkably reliant on his own family, remarkably white by the standards of all of the administrations in the United States since the 1970s. And there is just generally, as I say, this resistance to anything that seems to be likely to tie his hand or subject him to any kind of general rules. That includes the bureaucracy of the country and the Mueller investigation, which obviously make him frustrated and uncomfortable, less, in my view, because the investigation is likely to find any substantive wrongdoing, which may well be there, but just because he doesn't like to be subjected to the kind of rules that obtain for everyone else. So if that's essentially the character of the administration and the kinds of bases on which policy are made, what about the politics? How is it that this individual has upended 75 years of American political practice and succeeded in securing the presidency of the country? And who are his supporters, and what are they thinking about their support of him now? Clearly, in terms of the election itself, Trump was elected by what might be called anti-establishment voters, who were disappointed by what they viewed as the hypocrisy of the liberal establishment of the last, say, 40 years in the United States. And in that sense, I would say that this has been true since the Clinton administration in the 1990s. There is a sense that starting at least then, and one could probably take it to Reagan, but let's start with Clinton, there has been a willingness on the part of American political figures to talk a good line about how important equality is and how important rights are and so forth and so on, and actually not behave that way. So they talk a lot about how important it is going to be to empower various communities or constituencies in the United States, and then they don't do that. And by the time you got to this election, Hillary Clinton really represented that willingness to talk about how important it was to empower women and how important it was to care about welfare and so forth and so on, when most of the policies that she subscribed to and advocated didn't actually do that. And for those of you who follow American foreign policy, that's also an indictment, particularly of the Obama administration. But George W. Bush talked a lot about how important democracy is and didn't produce any. And in fact, Barack Obama talked a lot about how important democracy is and didn't produce much either. For the electorate, the foreign policy expression of this isn't that important, but certainly for the domestic sense that this was an elite that had lost touch with its constituents was pretty important and did account for a lot of the votes that Trump got. That we call populism. I'm not sure that is really populism in a technical sense, but that's usually what people mean when they talk about populism in the United States. In addition to that, as is often the case in elections like this, that is to say, historical elections of people who are this anti-establishment, there were several establishment groups that clearly thought that they could use Trump for their own purposes. That includes the Republican Party leadership that were not the never-Trumpers, but the people who eventually decided that although he wasn't their first choice, they would find him useful. And some of the funders of the Republican Party. And to some extent, the jury is still out about whether his administration is going to prove to have been useful to them. They certainly got the tax cuts for the corporate tax cuts that they wanted, and they're getting important judicial appointments, which are going to outlast all of us. So it may well be that the Republican Party establishment of that coloration were right to support Trump. But increasingly, the sense that Trump is so congenitally anti-establishment is clearly beginning to worry even them. Wall Street was very happy with the tax cuts and very unhappy with the tariffs and the prospect of a trade war. So it may be that they're not getting quite the instrument of their interests that they thought they were. Clearly, Trump's election, his campaign and his election has also empowered a group that we haven't seen visible in the United States in a long time, and that is the white nationalists. The embrace of the anti-immigrant agenda and the racist language that Trump is comfortable using has given a platform to groups in the United States that, as I say, haven't been visible in national politics in decades. Not clear that he's accomplished that much in substantive terms yet, but the permissive environment is corrosive from the point of view of many of the concerns that the liberal elite has even. There is also the possibility, and I'll get to this in a couple minutes when I conclude, that that will produce a backlash in electoral terms. And finally, there are obviously some foreign governments that have been hoping that the Trump administration would serve their purposes, whether or not they interfered in the elections. And I think this issue of interference in elections is going to turn out to be a complicated one, and anybody wants to think about advising dissertations, this is probably a good set of dissertations to look at, both empirically, because the question of what constitutes interference and how it happens, I think is an interesting one, and then whose ox is gored is also an interesting one. So there's a lot to be considered there, but it's pretty clear that Trump's election, at least, was embraced by governments that thought that they had a kindred spirit in someone who was not going to be concerned with human rights and not be concerned with the constraints of the liberal international order. That included Russia, of course. It also included a number of countries in this region. On that score as well, I think the implementation record continues to be somewhat mixed. It's not clear that Russia is going to be ultimately advantaged by the Trump administration. Clearly isn't apparent that the Chinese are going to be able to manage this embrace by Trump, since the trade tariffs and so forth don't seem to be consistent with an embrace of China. So the jury is still out on that one, I think. So apart from the tax cuts and the judicial appointments, which is this Republican Party leadership, everyone else who is invested in a Trump administration, I think it's not clear that they will get what they expect from this government. For prospects, just very briefly, I think it's pretty clear that increasingly, as Trump is unconstrained by the kinds of rules that he doesn't want to have to pay attention to, the businessman side of him is receding in favor of the reality TV star. And he says a lot of things about which substantively he is not serious. He's not actually that serious about policy in general, but he certainly enjoys the shock value and attention of breaking rules. And that will probably accelerate over time, since now he's in a position where he knows that works, he knows he gets attention, and I think it's very likely that he will sort of just ramp that up. The problem with that is that it could be very costly, both in terms of domestic politics. It certainly has already degraded the quality of debate about policy issues, and obviously it could be very costly and dangerous in international terms. The recent appointment of John Bolton as National Security Advisor is an indication of the willingness that Trump seems to be exhibiting to break more rules and break a lot of China. Let me just conclude then with the observation that even more than usual, the midterm elections in the United States are going to make a big difference. They are scheduled, as you know, for November. They're midterm because they are for members of Congress. Some of the Congress elections are simultaneous with the presidential elections, and some come in between. That's what the midterm elections are. There's obviously a lot of organizing around the midterm elections to see whether the Republicans can be deprived control of Congress, and Trump can be repudiated as a political leader. And in some ways, the gun rallies of yesterday do seem to bode well, if this is your view of things, for a very well-organized get out the vote effort in November. And in the meantime, I think it's very likely we will see more of those kinds of protests. Protests in the United States tend to be in the spring, as the weather gets nicer and people are outside more. So I think this is probably just the beginning of that. The Republicans are very worried, and so they themselves are organizing to retain control of Congress. It's going to be a very hotly contested set of elections, and so I think it's still going to be interesting to watch for the next few months at least. Thank you very much. We agreed that Professor Anheier and I will take questions after he speaks.
Thank you, Dr. Anderson, for an interesting talk about the new political realities in the United States. And now we have Dr. Helmunt Anheier, who will talk to us about the new political realities in Germany and Europe. Dr. Anheier is the president of the Hertie School of Governance and a professor of sociology. Dr. Anheier is the principal academic lead of the Hertie School's annual governance report, Oxford University Press. He received his PhD from Yale University in 1996, and he's an author of over 450 publications. Please, Dr. Anheier, we welcome you on board. Can I ask you please to join us? Thank you. Let me also mention that we have the bios of all the advisory board members on the tables for your reference.
Thank you. Yes, good afternoon. Let me thank the Dean for inviting me for this great hospitality, and also again the school and Nabil for the great progress that you have been able to make in the last few years. Is this better? Okay, thank you. It is very difficult to comment after hearing all the developments that are going on in the United States when you then look at Germany, right? And I asked Nabil, what should I say? And he said, well, tell them something that they don't know already, or what is less known about Germany. Of course, we all know that Germany is going to win the World Cup in Russia in summer, very likely, right? And you know that, of course, we all know that Germany is going to win the World Cup in Russia in summer, very likely, right? And you know that the country is obsessed with its past, right? Trying forever to come to terms with the crimes that were committed. It's also a country that functions fairly well, not everything. But I think if you were to look at the range of countries around the world, you would probably say that Germany is doing okay. And to some extent, that makes for dullness, right? And if you look at the slogan, the campaign slogan that Angela Merkel had last September, nobody would, I'm sure you won't know what that slogan was, right? But it's hard to beat for its lack of content. The campaign slogan for the Christian Democratic Union, and she's the chief, right, of that party, was a country where we live well and happily. Right? And that reminds you almost of Voltaire and Candide, where Voltaire describes this character that lives in Westphalia, and he thinks it's the best part and the best country where he live because he doesn't know any better. Right? And so I wanted to focus on several aspects of the situation in Germany that you may be less familiar with, and perhaps that also make you understand why the German government reacts in certain ways rather than in other ways. The first thing you need to know is that Germany is a very consensus-oriented country. And that has a very, very long history. It is consensus-oriented because it is also a very diverse country. It's a small country, of course. It has a population of just 82, 83 million, so it's smaller than Egypt. But in it has a great diversity, a regional diversity, and that is represented in the institutional mix of the country. And that requires a consensus approach in politics. It does not work well when you have adversarial politics in the country. And that's a way of policy making as well that has been practiced for a long time. Now, if you compare the United States and Germany, and you probably take France in between, right, as a third country, you would say that in France, very often things are led by government. They are state-led, right? So like what Macron achieved last May would have been impossible in Germany, right? Because this march through an entire country in a relatively short period of time. And so France is very often a state-led country. And when you look at the United States, it is almost the opposite of what France is, right? The less government, the better. And now Germany is somewhere in between, right? It has a very vibrant civil society. It has a very self-confident business community. And it has government. But they work together in very interesting ways. And I'll give you just a few examples. One is the welfare state. The welfare state in Germany is actually not a state affair. It is largely delivered through civil society institutions. The largest employer in Germany is not Volkswagen or Mercedes. It's the Catholic Social Welfare Association. And the second largest employer is the Protestant Social Welfare Association. And these are large networks of decentralized regional providers of healthcare, social services, education, you name it. Right? Some of the funding, much of the funding is actually provided by government, but delivery is through private means, which requires that of welfare state and social service policy requires the government to negotiate with these private providers. Right? The same with vocational training. Vocational training is provided in businesses, but it includes the self-administration of the business community, so independent actors, very often NGOs of many different kinds, and public schools, public vocational schools. Again, you see how these three sectors have to work together, and none of them can be ultimately dictating a particular policy agenda. You see this consensus orientation, and sometimes, not always, but sometimes it happens that they succeed in solving conflicts, deep-seated societal conflicts. And one of them, I think a very proud chapter of post-war history in Germany is co-determination. So that if you have a large corporation, then the employers have to have a seat on the board, right? And that can go up to parity. And it has the advantage that staff, employers, and workers are included in the decision-making of the corporation. But it has a disadvantage that issues may not become as readily solved. They may drag on for quite some time because of this significant amount of coordinating effort you need to do. So you saw something similar in terms of reform when it came to long-term care insurance. Right? So Germany was one of the first larger countries to have a long-term care insurance, and that again required this coordination, this consensus seeking. Now, is this good or bad for a country in the long term? Does it does it address the critical issues? And that's where I'm more negative. Because what happens, and I'm now focusing on politics, and I'm coming back to the fact that it took Angela Merkel 6 months to form a government, right? And we now have a coalition government. It's the Social Democrats and it's the Christian Democrats, right? Forming a coalition government. Now, the idea of a coalition government is not new. In fact, Germany has been governed by a coalition with very few exceptions forever, right, for over 70 years. But what we have is a coalition agreement. And a coalition agreement is much more recent. And it started in the early 1960s, when Adenauer was the first chancellor after World War II, and he was a very skillful politician, and he had a tendency of pulling wool on you, right? He's getting you, putting you across the table without you knowing what is happening to you. And it happened to the Free Democrats several times. And the Free Democrats said, no, this time it's different. This time we are going to have a memorandum of understanding that this is the policy we're pursuing when we join you in government, and you're not going to do tricks with us again. So they signed this very slim memorandum of understanding, and they instituted a coalition committee. And the coalition committee was to make sure that the government, once in power, does in fact do what is in the memorandum. Right? Now, two things happened over, fast forward 50 years. The coalition agreement that used to be a page and a half is now 170 pages. And that takes a long time to negotiate. Right? And the coalition committee, right, that's the bipartisan committee, is actually not foreseen in the Constitution, and it's not foreseen in the very process of the Parliament. So, but it has become the de facto most important seat where decisions are being made and overseen. So the coalition agreement is typically hammered out after the elections take place and behind closed doors, and not involving any popular participation at all, right? And that's where the cards are put on the table. So very often the elections are just the run-up for behind-the-scenes deal-making afterwards. And the coalition committee becomes the de facto government, but it's not controlled by the popular will. And you see, that's a deficiency in the German system at the moment. It devalues Parliament. It devalues actually the popular will. And if we just heard from Lisa what the origin of the, you might say, unhappiness in the electorate is, and those who actually no longer participate in the election, right? So in the German case, it would be seen as a behind-the-door policy-making rather than an open democratic debate. And so far, it has actually worked, and that's the curious thing about it, right? The country is doing well, the economy is doing well, but at the same time, you see there is a populist upswing coming up in the, and that's called the Alternative for Germany, the AfD, right? And they are now the largest opposition party in Parliament. And I think that is the dangerous thing, because you see this consensus-oriented behind-the-scene dealing that is typical of how policies are made in Germany has the disadvantage that it now opened up space and exposure to a populist right wing. So it'd be very, very interesting to see what the next 2 or 3 years bring. In Europe, we have European elections coming up next year, and we also have about 12 local elections, regional elections coming up in Germany. So, and that's all within the next 10 months. It'll be very, very 12 months. So the next year is going to be very, very crucial. So you have your midterm elections, we have the European and regional elections, and well, let's all hope for the best. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Anheier. Now we will open for Q's and A's. My colleague Lubna has the mic, so maybe she will pass it around. Thank you.
My question is to Lisa. So the liberal international order, everybody in the world accepted it with an implicit assumption that the political process in the United States is going to produce rational leaders. Obviously, that assumption no longer holds true. And the thing that a lot of us experiencing outside is actually panic, because all of a sudden we have somebody with a, diminishing power on the world, but still a lot of power, but completely. So how is policy made in this context? I mean, who is making the decisions? The use of the expression "the deep state" in this by Trump was for me very funny and puzzling. But so I need to understand more how decisions are made now. The second question has to do with the alt-right. And the racialized, even anti-nationalist, it's not nationalist, anti-nationalist in the sense that nationalism will mean some kind of an inclusion in a nation, but this is actually no. It's a very racialized, tribal. So where did that come from? And how deep it is and how entrenched it is in US politics these days?
The decision-making question is a puzzle because what's visible is basically the deadlock of Congress. The only thing that they've been able to get through of any real significance has been the tax cuts, and now Trump was forced to sign a spending bill that he had threatened to veto and so forth. So I would, that part you can see, and it's pretty incoherent. Not a great deal of. I mean, the spending bill is pretty much what anybody would have. It's just more money, but more money for the same thing. So the Republicans got more money for the military, and the Democrats got more money for social spending, and Trump got some money for the wall, and everybody decided that they just couldn't. So I wouldn't call that policymaking. I think everybody's sort of on automatic pilot because nobody really knows how long this is going to last. On the same theory, there's a lot of considerably less visible, but sense that the civil service of the federal government is trying to sabotage the senior Trump appointees who are trying to fire everybody in their bureaucracies. So, once in a while you see that in the discussions of the FBI, for example, or something like that. But it's across the board. I mean, the Environmental Protection Agency has a head, the director of the agency, has said that he thinks the agency should be disbanded and all the regulations rolled back. Okay? So that's the position of the head. Obviously, even if only for personal self-interest, not to say a concern for the environment, everybody in the agency is resisting everything he's doing. So similarly, there's this sense of paralysis. As in Congress, it's sort of obvious. In the bureaucracy, it's less obvious. So that's, essentially there's a sense that, Trump will do something, the local courts will reverse it, they will appeal it, so forth and so on. And so there's a lot of churning and not a lot of policy making. The two things that have happened that I think, as I said before, that are significant are, in fact, this tax cut, which is very much for corporate and so forth. Since everybody pays their taxes a year later, people aren't going to see until after the midterm elections what the real impact of the tax bill is on them. So it may not have much of an impact on the elections. And nobody sees for the moment the impact of the judicial appointments. But that probably is the most significant thing that's happened of any of this, is these judicial appointments, which can last 40 years. And the Republican right wing has been assiduous, and Jeff Sessions and everybody is very much with that program. So in that sense, they're taking full advantage of this moment where, in fact, they're good at the politics because everybody else is being distracted by everything else that Trump is doing and saying and so forth. In the meantime, they're boring into the sort of appeals level of the judiciary across the country. So I think that's going to be something we'll have to pay attention to in the long run. The appearance of the alt-right is really basically about how deep racism is in the United States. It's racist. It's not nationalist. So they call it white nationalist and things like that. This is racism. And racism, you know, there was an interesting kind of trajectory on racism in the United States. If you look at numbers, and now people are producing these numbers, if you look at numbers, there was a fascinating article in the New York Times last week about the likelihood that if you're born a rich and affluent African-American child, that you will stay rich. And the likelihood is very small. So most people born rich stay rich. But African-American males do not. So there's all sorts of data, you know, incarceration rates. African Americans are far more likely to be incarcerated. So all the things like, you know, driving while black and how dangerous that is, because of course you'll be stopped. I'm never stopped, but African American men are stopped all the time, so forth and so on. So there's clear segregation rates, and housing segregation is as bad as it's ever been, so forth and so on. Things that, you know, those of us who said, wonderful, Barack Obama's been elected president, it's over. It wasn't over. So what Barack Obama's election did was infuriate the racists without solving any of the problems of racism. So what you get now is African Americans who feel just as much betrayed by the liberal elite as anybody else in the country, and the racists being empowered. So what you see is this empowerment, and the racists are mostly about this historical American racism, but, you know, throw the immigrants in too. It's all of a piece. It's the same language, it's the same issue, so forth. And it's, you know, when the average American voter in the 1950s was a married Christian person. Now, fewer than 35% of voters in the United States are married Christians. So the married Christians who are racist are saying, wait, this is Make America Great Again. I want the country I knew in the 1950s when I was in the majority, I was married, I was respectable, I was Christian, I was white. Those people are the people who are coming up, and they had been, you know, they had been there, but they hadn't had a permissive, you know, anyone to amplify and acknowledge that. And in fact, particularly, I mean, the kinds of things that people said, I think I've mentioned this actually here, but the kinds of things that people said about Obama, the racism about Obama, was nothing compared to the racism about Michelle. Because Obama is, in fact, half white. Michelle is the descendant of slaves. And people said, somebody like that should never live in the White House. Now they can just say it like that. Before it was the alt-right, you know, sort of those websites and so forth and so on. Now it's everywhere. So, I mean, you know, if you want to take an optimistic view of this, and I tend to be a congenital optimist, as you all know, at least now it's open. Now we know it's there. And now we are getting the data on the fact that racism is still endemic in the United States. And we know that those problems haven't been solved. So maybe that's better, but that's what it is.
I just want to follow up on this because I'm sure you've been reading all the reports about Mr. Trump appointing John Bolton as the National Security Advisor, and the general sense that with Mr. Pompeo, with Mr. Bolton, and that we're, like, I was just reading an article that we're up for a hot summer, you know, particularly when it comes to Iran and I mean, I'm not sure about North Korea, that's not my area, but like, but generally speaking, I mean, do you agree with those points of views that the region should prepare itself for some tough time ahead, considering all the hardliners that exist right now surrounding Mr. Trump, and I'm not going to, of course, refer to the new CIA director, who also might be the first woman to fill this position, but she, according to the American reports, there is a history behind her in terms of practice of torture and waterboarding and all those other issues. Thank you very much.
Yeah, I actually do share a fair amount of concern on that front. I do think that the people who were routinely described as the adults in the room are leaving the White House. So I'm not sure they were as much adults as we said they were, but we took solace in the fact that there were people who had, you know, the person who would run ExxonMobil would presumably not be interested in carpet bombing the Gulf sort of thing. So we took solace in that. In the absence of a figure like Tillerson, it is more worrisome. And in the presence of a figure like Bolton, it's still more worrisome. So it seems to be shifting toward a kind of radical and militaristic approach to the world, even by Trump standards. It's the two things are hard to read, one of which is Trump continues to be quite deferential to his military leaders. So what the Joint Chiefs tell him and what the Secretary of Defense tell him about what's feasible is going to matter a lot. And in that sense, Bolton and Pompeo don't have any particular credibility compared to the military figures in the administration. So one could hope that the Joint Chiefs and the defense establishment will say, look, that's just not a feasible, clever thing to do. On the other hand, they've been trained since the beginning to defer to the commander-in-chief. So if the commander-in-chief says we're going to be, you know, taking military action in Iran, it's not clear that they dig in their heels. So I think there's reason to worry, particularly since I think Trump is somewhat impulsive and does think that, you know, this would be a good thing for the next edition of the reality TV show. He does clearly like to leave things hanging, leave things, people, you know, being tested and teased, if you will, with the next episode and so forth. So it's not clear that there is the kind of control on that that one would hope for, because, you know, you can leave everything for the next episode, but if in the meantime your staff says, well, I'm sorry, you can't do that, then he'll just do something else for the next episode. But if people aren't telling him he can't do it, then you run the risk that this is actually reality TV. This is Survivor. Only the question is who survives. So yeah, I must say I'm never been particularly sanguine, but I'm not getting any more reassured with these new appointments.
First, thank you both for coming to the board meeting and then also for speaking. It's always interesting listening to you. I want to ask you why rather than what happened. First to Helmunt, his country was working well. It was essentially efficient, quality of life reasonably high for almost everybody. Was the rise of this opposition party a function of foreign policy and the issue of immigration, or was it something else domestic? Because I want to think about what's going to happen next rather than what already happened. And I put the question similarly to Lisa. Electing Trump was a surprise to everybody, and I think you were right in saying even to him. That being said, he did not win the popular vote. But there were enough angry people there who got him the nomination from the Republicans and then to win the electoral vote. But is this a trend we're going to see, an angry constituency? And if you look at the demographics, the fastest growing demographic or voting community in the US are Latinos, if I'm not mistaken. Why would they vote for Trump? He's anti-immigrants, wants to put up the barriers. So I'm a bit perplexed about why. I know what happened, but why do you think these things happen in Germany or in the US?
Let me comment on the first set of questions. the AfD, the Alternative for Germany, started as an anti-Euro party, and it was led by economics professors. And it was in reaction, yeah, and it was in reaction to a speech Angela Merkel gave at the height of the financial crisis, when she said there is no alternative to bailing out countries like Greece and so on. And that did not go down well at all. But it remained a very small party with a lot of infighting still to this day. And then the migration crisis of 2015 happened. And that was indeed something that helped the AfD, because they had now their piece of propaganda that they could sell to the population at large. And that resentment which exists, I mean, there's no way of denying it, right? Not everybody in Germany is happy about migrants coming from Syria, coming from Africa, right? Particularly when it takes that proportion. And that reaction coincided with a general malaise that was felt by, well, we call them the losers of globalization, right? But they were not the kind of losers of globalization that you have in the United States, where people's living standard really dropped over the last 2 or 3 decades. It's just they see, oh, others are doing better than I am, not necessarily that they're doing worse, right? So these two strands came together. And that, in the context of the general inability of Germany to deal with right-wing parties, right, led to almost a reaction. We said, oh, you have to stand up if you have an opinion that is not with Angela Merkel, and it's not with the Social Democrats, it's not with the Greens, it's not with the Free Democrats, right? You're being treated as an outsider. So they had their mythology of being victims at the same time, right? And that resonated well with parts of the population. And they're now at 12% of the vote in the national elections. What reservoir do they have? I think the vote is out. In some parts of the country, up to 20%. But I think generally they probably caught on the right-wing spectrum politically, because that's also that part which Angela Merkel has given up, because she moved the Christian Democrats more towards center-left, and that opened up that opportunity right there. But they are not very nice people, the AfD, and perhaps that will also help them self-destruct to some extent in the next 2 or 3 years.
Speaking as an American, I don't think niceness seems to matter very much anymore, but look, I actually think Helmunt was beginning to say this about, there is rising inequality everywhere. So in some places you see not only the rich getting a lot richer, but the poor getting poorer. But more important, or in some places the poor aren't getting poorer, but the rich are getting richer. Everywhere you see a hollowing out of the middle class. And where you see a hollowing out of the middle class, you see the people who are invested in the system beginning to disappear. You know, that wonderful, the sort of burghers, the bourgeoisie, where are they? You care about the rules are to their benefit, it all works for them, work hard and the kids are going to do better and so forth and so on. That sense, so I think that you have, where you have rising inequality, you have an empirical correlation with these kinds of problems. And I think you can see why. Because people begin to mistrust the elites, because the elites are going off, becoming the 1%, and now people don't even talk in the United States about the 1%, they talk about the 0.01%. And at the same time, they're struggling. So to me, the long-term issue is a global issue. I don't, whether it's globalization, that's the other thing is that people see it in their lives. They see the effects of rising inequality. And then people talk these, words like globalization. Well, what does that mean? Does that mean foreigners? Well, then I'm against them. You know, and it's, you know, in the United States, or around the world, you can date it to the 1970s and neoliberalism, and you can, you know, all of us as academics can figure out these trends in history and so forth, but when you live it, you're angry. So I do think, in the United States at least, and I would say this is what's happening in Europe, in a lot of the countries, there is a rejection of the system because the system isn't serving me anymore. And I don't feel any obligation to it. And so I'm going to be much more violent, and I think you're going to see more violence in the United States. And right now it's being expressed in terms of these school shootings and things, but there are lots of ways to be violent. And express, so you can be angry in the way you vote, you can be angry in the way you talk and degrade the civil discourse, and ultimately I think you can be angry and be violent. And I wouldn't be surprised if you didn't see growing political violence in the United States, actually.
My question actually has to do with what Dean Fahmy have said, and also the point on globalization that is in fact been associated with the term Americanization for long. You know, a lot of our friends are talking about forming a war government in the US right now to hit on Iran. So what's the consequences if this scenario is valid? What's the consequences of this, you know, giving the foreign policy in the past 2 years of the US, and giving also what happened in Iraq and in Afghanistan, I'm sorry. And what is this has to do with terrorism? The more wars, the more terror, I guess, because these are going to be a vicious circle. And any terrorist act is going to be covered by mainstream media that is going to reflect on terrorism again for those who are suffering and still suffering until now. Also, what's the image of Islam now? What's the image of Islam in Germany and in the US? You know, we have almost the same numbers of Muslims in Germany and in the US. In Germany, there was this statement by the Minister of Interior saying that Islam is not part of Germany. Okay, very strange, you know, for you know, an official of this caliber really making this open statement to the media and really affecting Muslims living in Germany. And also, Muslims are living in the US are living in fear. So what's your reflections on all of this? Thank you. Thank you.
Let me perhaps say something on Islam and the Muslim community in Germany. The statement by the new minister, who is from the Christian Social Union, and he was the Prime Minister of Bavaria, a very conservative guy. That has a history because the former president of Germany said Islam belongs to Germany. And he said that about 10 years ago. And that has been a bone of contention with the political right ever since. And Wolf is his name, the former president, paid a heavy price for that because his presidency was undermined for various reasons, and that was one of them. And so it's an ongoing dialogue whether what the role of Islam in Germany is, right? And you heard a conservative response to that, and you had Wolf, who is also a member of the Christian Democratic Party, making what I would see the right response and a more progressive one. But the country and the country's political elite is divided on what the role of Islam is going to be. Because, not only because of Islam, but also because what is the role of religion in Germany in general? Because the Christian churches are going down in terms of membership and have been going on decreasing in importance in everyday life, but also institutionally for quite some time. So, and there are two growing religions in Germany at the moment. One of them is Islam and the other one is Judaism, right? And the relationship between Judaism and Germany is very, very complicated, right? So you have to see it in the context of that. It's not singling out only Islam on that. And the last word on this, that the Muslim community in Germany is not well organized. And they're actually quite divided. And I made a point in my brief remarks that Germany has this kind of highly institutionalized way of dealing with conflict, right? And a lot of it happens through organizations that are being created to handle the conflict and bring it into the political arena. And Islam has not managed to do that. And Erdogan has not helped in that context because he keeps financing some of those more controversial Islamic organizations.
I think the link of domestic politics and foreign policy in the United States at this juncture, clearly there's a fatigue with the war in Iraq and the war in Afghanistan. There's no doubt about that. But there isn't much of a strategic vision about how to get out or any, so, but you don't, as a political figure, you don't say, well, this is a quagmire we're stuck with, or something, can't say that. So what you end up doing, I think, is turn it into a security threat. That has several advantages. It just keeps it going as something that's not, we broke it, we own it, we need to fix it, because you don't have any way of doing that and you don't know how you would do it anyway. But it also means that, so you're justified in continuing because there's some amorphous threat out there. And that also has the advantage, as many of us know, security threats are great distractions from other kinds of policy issues. So if your real issue is things like universal health care or the effects of inequality or racial inequities or other things that you might want, you can't deal with all of that because you have this existential threat. So from the point of view of the United States, and in this I think it's a little bit different from Europe, there's nothing like being very far away from everything to be able to make this up a little, but I think it is true that one of the, if you will, advantages of having, Islamic terrorism around is it justifies your continued military spending sort of ad infinitum, and it also distracts people from the fact that you're not addressing the problems they're really confronting. So yes, people are losing their jobs because of manufacturing changes and so forth and so on, but there are terrorists. So I actually think that this is going to continue for some time in the United States because it serves too many short-term political purposes.
Thank you, Dr. Anderson. Thank you, Dr. Anheier. Thank you all for joining us today, and I hope you enjoyed lunch and the talk. Thank you.